In the walls and under the floor. I was born in the dark, though binary thinkers would disagree. Light did reflect upon the cold concrete walls, the stained hospital bed, and indeed myself, illuminating the rather crass scene of childbirth. The light produced by white-blue fluorescent lights hanging frivolously above. What I mean by that statement is that I have never truly seen the light, nor felt the warmth it bestows. I've never witnessed the miracles it creates. Nobody, especially in my community, knows exactly the sequence of events that transpired which resulted in the bombs. Ask 3 different people, and you'll probably get 3 different answers here. Some say it was the assassination of a world leader. Others believe AI had infiltrated the world's governments and decided to hit the reset switch on humanity. Or perhaps body-snatching aliens conspired against us and compromised multiple high-ranking officials. Though, the type of people who hold an annual subscription to a nuclear fallout shelter are typically the conspiratorial bunch. Therefore, I didn't give these theories much heed. Hell, it may have even been an accident, a faulty warning that was taken seriously. I hadn't even been conceived when the bombs hit, so any speculation on my part seemed myopic. The reasons, nonetheless, were unimportant. All that was that they had happened, and nuclear haymakers were swung upon every part of the world. My parents were conspiracy junkies. I grew up learning that 9/11 was done intentionally so the US government could invade the Middle East. That the moon landing was fake to best the Soviets. All the hits, really. They weren't so delusional to believe that the Earth was flat or that life was a simulation. They just really didn't trust people, and trusted bodies of government even less. That doesn't imply that they didn't like individuals, just that they had believed in the danger posed by groups of people without the ability to speak out. If that makes any sense. I suppose they were right to be suspicious. It was likely inevitable that once humanity crossed a certain threshold in history where no other earthly threat could end us except ourselves, that we would. That the hunger of some would eventually consume us all. When we realized that the struggle for power strangling our world was the hands of greed, all that time hypothesizing what could be the thing that chokes us, we failed to realize that the hands around our throat were our own. Nonetheless, my parents grew up in rural Montana. High school sweethearts, married at 20, and the whole cliché story. My dad, a hunting guide, had a knack for noticing things others didn't. Observant would have been an understatement. He was the type to boast about having never left the state of Montana, God forbid the US, though not in a patriotic way, more so a country boy way. My mother was an author, though perhaps aspiring author would have been a better term. She never fully completed a work. She had a collection of half-written books destined never to have an ending. They lived frugally, obviously, and were exceedingly self-sufficient. No inch of land on their small acreage was without its use. The house on the acreage was painted a pale sky blue, with battered steel-gray shingles lining the roof, a chimney jutting out from it. My parents said that the heat and comfort produced from a wood-burning stove was something that could not be replicated. A skylight was also installed, so, in the winter, they could sit and watch the stars, engulfed by the heat of the fire, sheltered from the cold outside. There was rarely silence in the home, despite its relative isolation, as my father always had a record on, providing ample opportunity to ask for a dance when he noticed my mother was growing increasingly frustrated, ailed by writer's block. His favorites included Dion and the Belmonts, John Mellencamp, and Jim Croce. Much to my father's dismay, my mother insisted on an unorthodox bright yellow door juxtaposed against the otherwise average-looking nuclear family home, symbolizing an open invitation for neighbors to stop by for coffee. I think I would have loved to see it. My room is not as idyllic. The walls are white block concrete. A heavy oak desk accompanies a cloth chair.
a bed laced with eggshell sheets and blankets, and a standing metal coat hanger. The only sound the generator switching as they power on and off. Dreamy, I know. There were 2 doors in the room. One led to the hall, and the other to my bathroom, which had equally as much personality. A word to tie the room together would have been monotonous. To be fair, that could describe most of the bunker.
It had a capacity of 300 people, though its max capacity sat around 700. Only approximately 40% of subscribers made it to the bunker, which, selfishly, I suppose, was good for the rest of us, myself included. Food, nor space, was ever a worry. This also allowed children, once they turned 18, to be given their own separate room should they choose. Now, don't get me wrong, I love my parents, but you can only spend so much time with people. In the community, every person has a role. Some children are drafted for engineering and power supply work to keep the bunker's figurative and literal lights on, while most eventually just join their parents in whatever it is that they do. Children first attend school, mimicking the system before the bombs, though knowledge is somewhat scattered as expertise in certain fields is sparse. But kids come out understanding the Pythagorean theorem and to read and write, which I am endlessly glad for, as reading and writing keep my sanity here. I guess you could call it genetic. Other kids use gaming systems or watch movies, which, don't get me wrong, is fun. I just prefer cracking open a Dickens or Christie when I get home from work or the library. The library here is one of the only facilities with any character. The whole room is carpeted, with different artwork sewn into the fabric depending on which part you're in. Lights are attached to the walls, and stained glass is hung over top, which bathes the various wooden desks in a rare amount of color. Though, most importantly, it smells different. The antique smell of books overpowers the mundane scent of concrete and rebar, overflowing with information about a world I'll never know. It's equally melancholic and wondrous learning about the outside world. Recently, I've discovered platypuses, or maybe platypi. The book, The Wondrous and Extraordinary Animals of Oceania, did not specify plural pronunciation. Nonetheless, these were the only mammals to lay eggs. They also had billed faces and produced milk. I'd hope to see one someday. An external Geiger counter and expert estimations show my platypus exploration will have to wait at least another 15 years. Although the Earth was rebounding, the veil of ash which blanketed the Earth's atmosphere was beginning to be shed. The radiation that lingered was just far too potent. I brushed off the depressing thoughts and tossed the book in my canvas bag, waving at the librarian, Lorene, as I left, taking one more inhale of the leather-bound air before opening the door. Lorene seemed happier lately. Her husband passed away recently, suddenly as well. Sudden deaths were a rarity here, due to rigid safety protocol, lack of dangerous activities, as well as the lack of sustainable medical treatment. That last one may sound contradictory, but sickness is typically a drawn-out process. After the death of a community member, the body would be jettisoned from the shelter's only exterior access point, an airlocked port only accessible from a key-activated maintenance elevator. The key safe kept in the warden's office on the second floor of the library. There was no real protection around the key, as escape was not really an option, lest you desired a radioactive surprise. Death and sickness were concepts we knew far too well. In the weeks following Lorene's husband's death, I felt terrible trying to read the ambiance of her silent weeping. I'm glad she's grieving now, though the pasted-on, ear-to-ear smile was somewhat unsettling. When I returned to my room, I was surprised that the light had been left on. At this point, it was muscle memory to turn any light off as you leave. Power misusage is taken very seriously in the colony. The colony school even had a cheesy motto instilled in us from birth, something along the lines of, too much light makes the whole world dark. Something that was far too obtuse for children to comprehend. I guess it was their attempt of simplifying the complex process without having to introduce generators or fuses. Yet, the message was still hidden behind a metaphorical blanket, ironically, leaving most kids in the dark. I strolled over to the desk, glancing at the framed pictures on the wall above it. Along with some poorly drawn, bright pink circular representations of my family and I, was the list. The list was something I tried to read at least once a week. It was a motivator. The carrot on a stick which kept my legs churning towards a greater goal, despite living in a glorified windowless tin can. It was hope, personified by a 9x11 page, inscribed in crayon, large and colorful font with equally infantile illustrations pictured alongside each sentence. The list contained the 5 things I wanted to experience outside. Once the smoke and ash that blanketed the Earth's atmosphere had cleared, and man could start over, ideally with a better grasp of the fragility of flesh and the permanence of ground. I created the list in the 5th grade, but my ideals had stayed fairly consistent over time. I created them after learning about the 5 senses the body has, and attributed one to each. For smell, my father said his favorite was captured in his hometown campground on a warm summer evening. The smell of barbecue, a sweet and tangy smell that could make you ravenous no matter how recently you'd eaten. Though it was really only the smell that I craved. Growing up on a strictly vegetarian diet had caused me to view the consumption of once living things to be foreign. My mother loved gardening, and until the age of 6, lived on an orchard a few kilometers outside of Honolulu. She swore that despite it being 30 years since she was there, the best fruit one could eat was grown there. Her favorite was a ripe Hayden mango. The fruit content in the shelter was obviously quite limited. Only those that prospered under a UV light could grow, as they had no access to sun or rain. The concept of rain was always interesting to me. Water vapors forming in droplets from humidity and then falling back to Earth, which powered almost every biotic organism, just seemed so planned. If you were to go to the highest point in the shelter, sometimes, you could hear a faint echoing rumble, a thunderstorm. However, only the vibrating force of thunder could be felt and heard through the imprisoning shield of concrete. I was told that the sound of rain pattering lightly against a window was said to be tranquility incarnate. Touch was obvious for me. A dog's fur. As someone who had never interacted with another animal other than humans, the idea of an animal that you could pet just seemed so interesting to me. Mr. and Mrs. Smith brought their dog with them into the shelter, but it passed before I was born. The final and most substantial, demonstrated by its picture taking up nearly half the page, was a sunrise. The sun always seemed so incorruptible to me, distant enough that nothing man could ever do would impact it. It simply sat alone in space, shining upon the earth, whether there was life upon it or not. I've always wanted to see the light slowly conquer a darkened sky, peeling away at the night until it completely overwhelms it. I sat for a minute, pondering these experiences, staring at the crayon sunset. The list could be difficult to read, as these experiences were imprisoned within my imagination for the foreseeable future. I had waited so long, my entire life, and yet had so long to wait. I set the frame back on its hook and sat back in my chair, prepared to do nothing for a while. However, some movement in the hallway interrupted my moment. Footsteps moved deliberately slow down the hallway, their attempt at stealth betrayed by heeled shoes. The fact that someone was out for a walk here was strange. This wing of the shelter had just been expanded into as the communal population began to grow. I was virtually the only occupied room in the entire floor. I had no such hindrance in stealth wearing socks, and quickly moved to the peephole in front of my door. Looking through it, I was surprised. It was Lorene. She walked with a sort of stutter, rigid, as if she had to think about each step. She held her arms at hip level, arching her wrists down, as if doing some crude impersonation of a T-Rex. She makes a light wheezing noise as she walks, as if hyperventilating. Was she drunk? I mentally laughed off that suspicion. The woman was a 65-year-old librarian. I couldn't imagine her getting lost on her way home from a rager. Any amusement ceased when she turned her head towards my door, the same smile still pasted on her face. She holds my gaze for a moment,
as if she knows that I'm right behind the door, and in an instant moves impossibly quickly to the grate in the floor, and with a strength an old lady could not possess, tears it off and slips through. I can't move from my spot in front of the door, my mind desperate to find a reasonable explanation for what I just witnessed. My heart throbbed against my chest and seemingly stopped as a few breath-held moments later, the grate opens ever so slightly. Her forehead peeks out just enough for her eyes to scan the hallway like a submarine's periscope. I can see enough of her mouth to know that she is still adorning that supernatural smile. In one movement, she pushes the grate off and steps out from the floor, stuttering back down the hallway. I finally let myself breathe once her shambling was out of earshot. I stumble backward on my bed, trying to focus on a barrage of questions that I know I can't answer. What was that? Who was that? It certainly wasn't Lorene. Most importantly, what is under that floor grate? I thought back to all my interactions with Lorene, the unwavering smile, the fact that she only ever waved and never spoke, the uncharacteristic dust which caked onto bookshelves when typically they were clean enough one could eat off them. This wasn't Lorene. This was something else, something impersonating her, intelligent enough to know her routine. The revelation created a war zone in my mind as more questions bombarded me. Was she dead? Were others also being impersonated? Reporting it seemed meaningless at best and suicidal at worst, as there was no telling who else was, well, not real. The only real answers to my questions lay underneath the subterranean entrance in the hallway. I questioned myself on if I was really about to do this. I had just experienced something which shattered my illusion of reality, and now felt the responsibility to confront something entirely inhuman for the sake of an old librarian? I suppose so, as I peeked into the hallway. At this point, any person was suspicious. The grate was heavy, rusted metal dug into my sweaty and reddening hands. A void stared back at me once the grate had been freed from its indentation in the concrete. The darkness below was all-encompassing. I couldn't tell the depth or content of whatever lay beneath. The supply closet nearby would likely have a flashlight. I slid the grate back over, in the off chance Lorene, or whomever is impersonating Lorene, returns. Trying my best to keep my steps inaudible, I made my way to the closet, which was a few rooms from my own. I scanned the dust-caked materials lining the shelves, pushing aside concrete nails and empty toolboxes until I find a flashlight. My jubilation of finding what I'm looking for was snuffed out by a noise. It seemed almost to be an intense sniffling, not that unsimilar to that of a dog searching gopher holes. I take a step back to the partially closed door, pulling just enough to shut it, twisting the handle to smother the sound of the latch clicking into place. The ever-so-soft click is still enough to echo through the cold, empty hallway. The sound aggravates the sniffling. It becomes loud enough to make me doubt a human could be the cause. I hear the grate explode off the floor with enough power to ricochet off the roof and back to the floor, resulting in two thunderous gunshot-esque sounds vibrating through the hall and closet. I stand on the other side of the door, staring breathlessly through the peephole. A blur of motion moves past my limited line of vision. My relief palpable as the incessant sniffling decreases in volume, but soon fails to fade any further. To my abject horror, it turns, the haunting sound reverberating through my brain as it grows louder and louder. It stops in front of the door. It appears to be a woman, staring down at the floor. Its lurched-down neck rises slowly, revealing a face. I almost cry out as I recognize the face of my mother, staring down my door. Her face is a mess of wrinkles, as if she had been soaking in a tub for days. The skin appears to have almost no pigmentation or blood running through it. Her once joyful and compassionate eyes have been robbed and replaced with cold black pearls. A smile is forced upon her face, though no joy is brought by it. The sniffling has stopped as she puts her palm
on the door. A scream momentarily cuts the tension, catching the attention of whatever is wearing my mother's skin. She turns, and, in an instant, is out of the peephole's field of view. That was the moment. Before I watched her turn and shamble away, I watched those lifeless black eyes stare through the door deep into my own. That was the moment my world fell apart. I sat in the dark for hours, waiting for things to fix themselves, to be found by my parents and hoisted upon my father's shoulders like when I was young, to hear his voice speak comforting words, telling me that everything was going to be okay. I knew it wasn't. I knew from the screams filling the halls that nothing was going to be okay. This extraterrestrial infiltration would eventually find me, perhaps the final survivor, and my end would be a pitiful one. But it didn't have to be. I could search under that grate. Even if I was torn to shreds upon entry, I would at least die on my own terms. I emptied the contents of my stomach onto the dilapidated floor before grabbing the flashlight and peeking into the hallway. Optimism and desperation, my arsenal for what lay ahead. The strength of the intruders was immensely clear. A nasty gash in the concrete adorned the roof, as well as the crater on the floor. The light from the torch illuminating the hole in the floor. The drop was probably around 4 feet. My feet squelched as I hit the ground. I had braced for a hard landing which never came. The floor had practically absorbed my entire weight as I sunk about an inch into it. A sweet metallic scent overwhelmed me. The smell was more benign than assaulting. It reminded me of the utility closet at the agriculture center, which contained decade-old rusted tools. I shined the torch in each direction. Stealth was not going to be an option, given my noisy and moist landing. The room's size was difficult to estimate, and its appearance impossible to articulate. Almost everything was the same shade of matte black as the floor. The walls gave a honeycomb-esque appearance with various pores oozing sludge out and onto the floor. Once hit with light, the oozing sludge revealed a darkened burgundy color. It took a considerable effort just to walk forward, both literally and metaphorically. The sludge bestowed an adhesive property upon my boots, clinging to the soles before snapping back as the boot rose. The decade-old flashlight's likely corroded battery caused the light to cut in and out. In a moment of complete darkness, a faint light caught my attention. I flicked off the torch and approached the light slowly, the viscous substance below my feet ensuring that. The light was produced from a hole in the wall, around 7 feet high and 4 feet long. A green bioluminescent pod sat inside, the humidity in the air obfuscating whatever lay within. The pod had a gelatin-like texture, which pressed in slightly as I brushed away the moisture. I stumbled backwards when I uncovered a face, one I knew. It was Miss McCallum, a school teacher here. I rose back to my feet, wiping away the rest of the moisture, doubling over as I realized this was no longer a recovery mission. It looked like an anatomy project. She was suspended in a clear, dense liquid, all her body parts having been separated. Her arms disconnected at the elbow and the legs at the knee. The torso was parted at the hips. It appeared as if a full autopsy had been done as well. Above the pod was a hook connected to a bar, similar to a shower curtain. The pod could be moved. With considerable effort, I shifted it enough for another pod to come into view. Another body flayed apart. Next to this one hung what appeared to be a human-like shape made entirely of spiderwebs. Hundreds of stringy lines hung down from an exposed brain and eyes. I didn't need to see any more. Retracing the steps I had made on the way in, I maneuvered myself back to the great entrance. What was I to do now? I pondered, pulling myself from the blackened nightmare cavern. I sat on the concrete. The screams had died down, the double entendre unintentional. In the momentary silence, my thoughts lingered to those like me.
Not the others who lived in this community, but rather the entirety of humanity. It was unlikely that this was the last pocket of humanity. Surely other groups shared the protection within the Earth's crust. People who endured our struggle, so that one day they could also emerge and start anew. And eventually, they may discover this place and unleash the hellish occupancy of a shape-shifting Pandora's box. I knew I had a higher purpose now. A sacrificial one, but purpose nonetheless. Equipped with a clear objective, I slipped into my room, grabbing a pen, paper, a glass bottle, and my list. I had to warn them, and in order to do that, I had to go to the surface.